What is going on, football fans? Back at it with another New York Giants video. Got a lot to talk about today. Going to try to get it through as quickly as I possibly can, but I'm going to go over 3 topics for the New York Giants. We're going to condense them into one video. One thing that we're not even going to talk about is the defensive coordinator. Of course, word came out a couple of days ago that the Giants, if he is not hired somewhere else in terms of being a head coach, will bring back Patrick Graham to be the defensive coordinator for this football team. Graham now is going to have his second interview with the Minnesota Vikings, and to my knowledge, I think it's down to 4 finalists, including Jim Harbaugh, who they're actually flying in on Wednesday. If Jim Harbaugh is going to be flown in, I would guess he's probably the favorite to potentially land that job. But if Graham were to get the job, the New York Giants would be looking for a defensive coordinator. In addition to that, the good news would be that the Giants would receive 2 third-round compensation picks per the new Rooney League rule. So it'll be interesting to see how that all plays out. If Graham gets the job, the Giants will get 2 third-round picks, but will be looking for a DC. If Graham does not get the job, I would assume that Graham will be back with the New York Giants. But in this video, we're going to touch on a lot of things. We're going to touch on the offensive coordinator search for the Giants. Word has come out that Ken Dorsey now will be staying with the Buffalo Bills. Who is the guy that the New York Giants may be looking at? Well, Jordan Renan brought out a name I've talked about in the past during these offensive coordinator searches due to his ties with Joe Judge that the Giants may be interested in. We'll talk a little bit about him and why he was passed up on in Miami back in 2019. Also, going to touch on the article that came out regarding what Joe Schoen had to say yesterday, and he gave us an exact dollar amount of what he's going to look to shed off of next year's salary cap. He said $40 million, and I'll look at the salary cap. I'll dive into the players that I think the New York Giants could potentially look to cut to try to save that $40 million in savings. Of course, there's a lot of ways the New York Giants could go about doing that. You don't necessarily have to cut a player. You could potentially extend a player. You could potentially trade a player. There's options that the New York Giants will look into, but I'll dive into the salaries and talk about the players that I think are most likely to be cut to try to save that $40 million that Joe Schoen is looking to do. Also, we're going to dive into the new offensive line coach for the New York Giants, that being Bobby Johnson, brought over from the Buffalo Bills, which I like more so than anything else. I'll be the first to say I don't know a ton about him. He's been with the Bills for a number of years, 3 years now as the offensive line coach, and we'll dive into just how good of a job he's done. But the thing I like more so than anything else is the familiarity. We talk about continuity. That's what Joe Schoen said in his opening press conference. Well, you would think if you bring in a guy like Bobby Johnson who has strong ties to Dable and Shane that they would not look to get rid of this guy after 1 year. They've worked with this guy. They obviously like him, and that's been a problem for the New York Giants, specifically on the offensive line. Last year, the New York Giants basically had like 4 offensive line coaches. The year before, they went through 2 offensive line coaches with Mark Colombo and, of course, Dave DeGuglielmo. They brought in Pat Flaherty. They had a number of assistants this year. A lot of people said maybe there's too many cooks in the kitchen. Well, that probably will not be the case this year. I expect the New York Giants to condense that and hopefully only have 1 offensive line coach. But I would think Johnson more than likely will be here for a while, which is a good thing as you try to build up that young offensive line. Here is his resume. Started at Akron, went to Miami of Ohio, then went to Indiana, got his first NFL job with the Buffalo Bills as an assistant offensive line coach, then went to Jacksonville in 2012 as a tight ends coach, went to Detroit for 2 years as a tight ends and assistant offensive line coach, to the Raiders for 3 years as a tight ends coach, then was the assistant offensive line coach with the Indianapolis Colts. That year, if you remember, the Indianapolis Colts had a dramatic improvement in their offensive line play. They went from one of the worst to one of the best. Obviously, Quentin Nelson had a lot to do with that, but he was the assistant offensive line coach for that team, then went to the Buffalo Bills as the O-line coach from 2019 to 2021. We'll dive into exactly what he did with that football team. Johnson carried a monumental task in 2021. With the Bills' offensive line in a constant state of flux, only center Mitch Morse started every game at the same position. Got these quotes off GiantsWire.com. Left tackle Dion Dawkins started training camp on the COVID-19 list and didn't round into form until a few weeks into the season. They flipped right tackle Darrell Williams into the right guard and started rookie Spencer Brown for the remainder of the season at right tackle. And then they named 4 other guys that played the guard position throughout the year. It was a constant struggle with COVID as well, and Dawkins, Brown, and Feliciano all missed time. So he had a lot to deal with this year with that offensive line. We already went over the coaching history, so I'll skip over that. This coming out from the Buffalo Rumblings. One more thing worth noting, Bobby Johnson's connection was through Brian Dable, not McDermott and Frazier. Johnson worked in Indy under offensive line coach Dave DeGuglielmo, Dable's former line coach in Miami and colleague in New England. So that is, I guess, the connection to Dable, and that is probably why he came over to the New York Giants. To what I think what I read was Bobby Johnson's contract expired with the Buffalo Bills as well, and now the New York Giants continue to pick up members from the Buffalo Bills, despite talking about earlier all the all the challenges that Bobby Johnson had to deal with on last year's offensive line. This is how they still performed. And yes, I know their run blocking was probably not the best due to the fact that the Buffalo Bills were not that good in terms of running the football, but this in terms of pass protection. Last season, the Bills' offensive line finished tied for 10th in pass blocking efficiency rate at 86.8. With Arizona, Buffalo allowed just 198 pressures, 8th fewest in the league, and their 27 sacks surrendered were the 2nd fewest allowed in the league last year, only behind the Tampa Bay Bucks. They did that despite having the 5th most passing attempts. So they allowed only 27 sacks, which was the 2nd fewest, while having the 5th most passing attempts in football. Some of that certainly probably has to do with Josh Allen and the offensive scheme, but regardless, it looks good for Johnson. I'm glad he's with the Giants. The biggest reason why, like I said, I think it probably spells continuity. I expect Johnson to be here for a bit with this coaching staff. Let's get on to the next story. The Giants have to either fix Daniel Jones or replace him in 2023. And Shane told me Saturday he'll have to clear out $40 million from a bloated and mismanaged salary cap this spring. When we first got to Buffalo, said Shane, we had $55 million of dead cap money and that we had to manage. We had a plan there, and we'll have one here. We may have to make decisions that hurt, but I do not want to kick the can down the road with the cap. I want to get it fixed. I absolutely love hearing that. When he says he doesn't want to kick the can down the road, that means as a fan base, don't expect the New York Giants this offseason to go out there and spend in free agency. Of course, they have to fill out this roster. Much like 2019, I expect the New York Giants to try to make some cost-effective moves. Remember when they brought in, I think it was Marcus Golden for like a $3 million deal. They signed Antoine Bethea. Obviously, we hope for better than that. But I expect the New York Giants to bring in a lot of one-year contracts and flip those guys over into the next season where they will have a lot more cap space. And hopefully at that point, due to our draft picks, the team will be further developed, and then it'll make a little bit more sense to start to spend in free agency. Also, in that year, you'll be able to get guys off the books such as Leonard Williams, if he's not performing quite well. His dead cap will not be nearly as high as it is this year. The same can be said for a guy like Kenny Golladay. So I think that's the right approach. And also, the current free agents that are on the New York Giants, if they sign with other teams and the New York Giants don't spend much this offseason, they will be compensated. In terms of that $40 million number that they want to save, which I like hearing, he's being very forthcoming. He's telling us his exact plan. Let's go over some of the players that right now are under contract for the New York Giants and some of the things that they could do. Keep in mind, there's a lot of guys on the back end that you could cut. Of course, they'll have to be replaced. Only the top 51 go against the cap, and you could redistribute some salary. There's a lot of things that Kevin Abrams and the New York Giants could do, but the most obvious names at the top of this list are going to be James Bradbury and Blake Martinez. Combined, if you were to cut both, it would save you approximately $20.5 or $20.6 million of that projected $40 million that Joe Schoen is looking to save. That they may not necessarily cut both of these players. Maybe they cut one, maybe they cut neither, but I think at a bare minimum, if they're going to stay on, they are going to redistribute these salaries. But let's just say for the sake of, of this video that they cut both. That would save you 20.6. Then you get to Sterling Shepard. Sterling Shepard would save you another $4.5 million. He's 12.5 to keep, $8 million to cut. We know that Sterling Shepard more than likely is not going to play next year. So suddenly you're up to $25 million in savings for next year's cap. As you go down this list, Kyle Rudolph's another $5 million, 7.4 to keep, 2.4 to cut. I think that's an obvious cut. Now, all of a sudden, we're at $30 million. The next name at the bottom is Devontae Booker, $3 million to keep, $1 million to cut. It's a savings of 2.1. Now we're at $32 million. And then if you go further down this list, Riley Dixon absolutely needs to be cut. That saves you close to $3 million. Now you're at about $35 million in savings. Nick Gates could save you another 2.1 if you were to cut him. Maybe they cut him, bring him back on a cheaper salary if they feel like he could play. Of course, he's coming off of 7 leg surgeries. I know Giants fans love the guy, but it may be in the best interest of this team if they feel like he cannot reach his form of years past, and we'll see how that all plays out. That gets you to 37. And then if you look at some of these back-end guys, Darius Slayton saves you 2.5. He's a possible cut, or maybe a guy you look to trade at least. Julian Love, 2.7, $192,000 dead cap hit. played relatively well for the Giants next year. I don't know if they'd look to cut him. New coaching staff, everything else. Caden Smith carries no dead cap hit, yet has a $2.5 million salary. O'Shane Zimenez would save you $1 million if you were to cut him. So the New York Giants should have no problem shaving off that $40 million that Joe Schoen talked about. It's just a matter of how are they going to go about doing it? Are they going to look to extend players, which I don't think they're going to do based on what Joe Schoen had to say about kicking the can down the road? Leads me to believe that at least one of, if not both, James Bradbury and Blake Martinez will be cut by the New York Giants this offseason. But we'll see how that all plays out. But that's how I see the salary cap playing out and how Joe Schoen will save that $40 million. If he saves the $40 million, at least according to Spot Track, that would give the Giants roughly $30 to $35 million in cap space, depending on where you look. 12 to 15 of that is going to go towards the draft, and that doesn't leave you a whole lot of money in free agency. Maybe you sign a stopgap guard on a 1-year deal or a 2-year deal, and a couple of other pieces here and there, but don't expect big splashes by the New York Giants. Next thing we're going to talk about is the offensive coordinator search for this football team. Of course, a lot of us were hoping that the Giants were going to bring Ken Dorsey along for the ride with Brian Daboll. Dorsey was the quarterbacks coach for the Buffalo Bills and was widely credited with the improvement in Josh Allen's game. Well, bad news, Giants fans. This coming out from the Buffalo Bills. We've promoted Ken Dorsey to offensive coordinator. Congratulations, Ken. Then, Jordan Moran had this to say about the offensive coordinator search. The Giants have been doing extensive interviews on potential offensive coordinators. Among those in the mix are Browns pass game coordinator / wide receiver coach Chad O'Shea, per sources. Connection to Brian Daboll from his time in New England. Chad O'Shea was actually the first guy that Brian Flores fired in 2019. I'll pull up his resume for you guys as well in terms of what he's accomplished throughout his career. I remember people were talking about him when we had Judge as a potential candidate that we could look to bring in as well due to his ties with New England. But this is what Chad O'Shea's done throughout his career. We're going to skip all the college stuff. Started out as a volunteer assistant in 2003 with the Chiefs. Then became an assistant special teams coach for 2 years from 04 to 05. Went to the Vikings as an offensive assistant for a year. Then became an offensive assistant and wide receivers coach for a year in 2007. In 2008 was an offensive assistant, wide receivers coach, and assistant special teams coach. So he got more and more responsibility. Then was with the Patriots from 2009 to 2018 for like 10 years straight as a wide receivers coach before finally landing himself an offensive coordinator position with Brian Flores with the Miami Dolphins, and Flores fired him after 1 year. I'll get into the reasoning as to why Flores supposedly fired him according to the article and according to some of the players on that Miami Dolphins football team. Of course, now hindsight 2020, we have found out that Brian Flores in 3 years with the Miami Dolphins went through, I think, 4 offensive coordinators. So maybe it wasn't so much O'Shea as it was potentially Brian Flores being hard to work with. Then with the Cleveland Browns the last 2 years was the wide receivers coach and passing game coordinator. This was the supposed reason why, or at least one of the reasons why the Miami Dolphins moved on from O'Shea. The Patriots offense, which is, of course, where he came from, he coached there for 10 years as the wide receiver coach previously, is considered complex. But a player said O'Shea made the situation worse by trying to install especially complicated advanced elements of the Patriots offense that Brady and offensive coordinator Josh McDaniel used. So it seems to be another case, or at least potentially another case, of a coach that tried to do things the Patriot way and it didn't necessarily work out at another destination, which of course you could say about Joe Judge, so on and so forth. That doesn't mean that Chad O'Shea couldn't be a great candidate for the New York Giants, and due to his ties with Brian Daboll, you would think that Brian Daboll really likes him if he were to bring him on with the New York Giants to be the offensive coordinator. He may not be the guy, but he was a guy that I wanted to bring up and talk about because I saw that Renan talked about him specifically as a guy that the New York Giants are potentially looking into. Unfortunately, Ken Dorsey will not be back. We'll have to wait and see how it all plays out. I'm waiting to hear about Patrick Graham. I'm waiting to hear about the offensive coordinator search. $40 million, I think it's pretty cut and dry as to who the New York Giants could be looking to move on from. And I'm excited about the new offensive line coach. If anything else breaks today, I'll be sure to have a video out for you guys. But thank you guys for watching. As always, if you liked what you watched, please subscribe, drop a comment, maybe give me a little thumbs up. Cheers.